So after many months, I've finally finished The Dawn of Everything by, like a subtitle, A New History of Humanity by David Wengrow and David Graeber. This is like a very well-worn copy. I've carried it with me forever because nonfiction takes me forever to get through, and it is a very large book. But I kind of wish I would have gone through it chapter by chapter. Probably would have been more useful to me. There are, I guess, 12 chapters, including the conclusion. I didn't realize there was that many. It didn't feel like there was that many chapters. But there's so much to each chapter, as they're huge. So I have taken some notes to try and refresh my memory, because, like I said, I started reading this, I don't know when, many months ago. So I guess it started as a book on the origins of inequality. It sort of became a book on the origins of humanity, on civilization, on sort of early history of us, of humans. Try and get at why we live in the world that we live in today, why we live in a world where inequality is such a big issue, why we live in a world where we don't have the freedoms that we may have used to or may not have used to. So yeah, there's the book uses many different examples from the authors are an anthropologist and an archaeologist, so those are the two fields they draw from, anthropology and archaeology. So one of the first things that sort of stood out to me was how they argued that the European Enlightenment in the 17th century was initialized, catalyzed, sparked by indigenous Native American thought and philosophy, and how these sort of new ideas of freedom and liberalism and individuality and equality and equity, maybe not equity, but ideas of different ways of living, almost a democracy, sort of anti-hierarchical, anti-monarch, anti-autocratic thinking. It was very new in Europe during the Enlightenment, from my understanding, and that's why they called it the Enlightenment. It was sort of a dawning of this sort of thought. But they argue that it can't be a coincidence that all these ideas are percolating around in Europe just about a century or two after Columbus meets with the Americas, and so many Europeans go over to the Americas for conquest and for other reasons. But there are ethnographers and sort of anthropologists. It's not good to give them those names, but people have gone over and heard the native ways, the Native American ways of living and ways of life, and how some of those Native American philosophers and politicians and thinkers actually traveled to places like Paris in the 17th century, and spoke to people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or maybe not spoke to, but spoke to sort of the elite, the intellectuals in Europe at that time, and how it was this free flowing of information both ways across the Atlantic that sort of led to what we now know as the European Enlightenment. And eventually led to the revolutions of the late 18th century, the American and French revolutions, with fraternity, equality, liberty, equality, fraternity. How these all originally came from the Native Americans, who sort of looked on in horror at the Europeans, and how they lived their lives, and how they were content to be sort of subjugated by the king, in the case of France, how they were so unfree. And like the authors use examples that sort of democracy and freedom were seen as very much bad things prior to the Enlightenment. How the sort of the missionaries and the Christians first coming to the New World are kind of disgusted by the freedoms that the Native Americans have, and say how horrible it is, because it's so unstructured, I guess, and I guess it's just not ordered. That they see it as chaotic, and of course barbaric or savage is the terminology they would use. But how a century or two later, that's sort of their Native American thinking gets adopted into European culture, and spurs the great revolutions. Anyway, so that's sort of one thing. Another is they talk about Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. If I remember correctly, Thomas Hobbes was the one who sort of said that humanity was in sort of an idyllic, nature-like state that he compared to the Native Americans living in sort of freedom in concert with nature, sort of happy, egalitarian, primordial state. And then became civilized and got sort of trapped in civilization. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau is sort of the one who came up with the idea that this progress, human progress, human civilization marching towards the present, and the inevitable initial human hunter-gatherer bands, and then the bands sort of united as tribes, which became chiefdoms, which became states, and how this is all an inevitable march of progress towards better and better civilization, and how we humans gave up our freedoms that we initially had back in our primordial states, in order to sort of gain the civilization that we have. It's really hard to express this, but I guess that was sort of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea. And of course, these guys in the book give many examples to refute this, saying Rousseau has sort of not tainted, corrupted, but sort of influenced our thinking and our understanding of human history for so long, that this sort of subcurrent of sort of the romantic Garden of Eden innocence that was lost, and how we've sort of marched onward, progressed, and like when we see people's living today, not in sort of our modern liberal states, or not even liberal, our modern states, we see them as being sort of primordial, or as an example of what we were like in the past, and how we're advanced and they're primitive, when it's really not the case. Now, technologically, we could be more advanced, in term, or maybe that's not even the right way. Maybe it's a problem with language, with complexity. We are more complex, and they say this in the conclusion, how complexity leads to sort of an understanding of there must be a hierarchy if there's a complexity. If there's a hierarchy, then that's sort of a euphemism for some sort of inequality. But like I said, they show many examples throughout human history where there wasn't a linear progress. There was people throughout the past thousands of years have dabbled with hierarchy, with autocracy and monarchy, and more egalitarian, sort of communist, socialist. People have tried all different sorts of things, and sometimes rejected them and left them. They talk about, I think it was the Hopewell civilization in the Midwest of what is now the U.S. Like many centuries ago, that was sort of a very hierarchical state and then was just abandoned at some point. So the people sort of gave up on it. So we think what we're sort of trapped in. I guess the big one is the agricultural revolution. Once we discovered agriculture, which there's a whole thing about how people have been sort of growing their own food, and like the difference between hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, and agriculturalists. There's no hard barriers. People would plant and grow some stuff, and they do play farming, and how sometimes seasonally they grow some things during this season, and then other seasons they'd be more pastoral, and then other seasons they'd be more hunter-gatherer, and depending on locations, like there was no agricultural revolution. This took place over centuries of people knowing how to farm, knowing that farming is a thing, and either rejecting it or ignoring it or sometimes using it. There was no hard cut. We finally discovered how to farm wheat. So now, oh no, we're trapped in this one place because we have to stay here to grow our wheat all year round. And now that we have lots of wheat, other people will want to come and also grow wheat. And if I own this property, then I can grow the most wheat, and that will give me power over others because they want my wheat. And then private property and hierarchy and monarchy, and that's sort of idea. It makes sense. It's logical in a sort of simplistic way, and because it's sort of simple, we accept it because it's natural to want sort of simplistic, easy solutions for problems. But they give many examples throughout human history where this is not the case. There was no hard cut agricultural revolution that over a span of a couple generations locked us into giving up our freedoms in exchange for domination, but security and food security and whatnot. I should mention the sort of the three freedoms that they talk about. So there's the freedom to move, which throughout most of human history, that meant if you're in sort of a social arrangement where there's a king over you, there's a chieftain over you, or even one that's sort of an egalitarian, a community of sharing or whatever, having the freedom to move means having the freedom to leave that sort of, not state, because the word state's so loaded, but that social arrangement, leave that society and go off to another country, or not country, that something else, but how the freedom to move, the freedom to leave when you don't like how things are going is one of the freedoms. And I think like because the entire sort of geography of the earth now is cut up into various nation states, the United Nations, we don't really have that freedom anymore. Like if I'm in Canada and I don't like how Canada operates, there are sort of some ways that I can maybe move to another country, but sort of the way that things are run isn't going to be much different unless it's like really bad, because Canada's relatively good, but it's still, or even just like I have the freedom to move within the country if I have the money to be able to afford to move. If I don't, then I do not have that freedom. But that's the first, for the freedom to move. The second freedom is the freedom to disobey others. So if someone gives you an order, being free and having the freedom to say, no, I'm not going to follow. Why would I follow what you, another human being, tells me, a human being? Like, why would I, like, if I am forced to obey, that's somehow arbitrarily saying that you have some sort of power over me. So yeah, freedom to disobey. Again, in 21st century Canada, that's not a freedom we have. We have the state, the courts, and their police officer enforcers, that if a police officer tells you to do something, you do not have the freedom to disobey them. And if you do, you are then subject to violence or incarceration. So we can have the freedom to disobey orders from some people, but not from those in authority over us. We, in a sense, we are in an authoritarian state. I mean, an authoritarian state means something totally different, but we are in a state. There are those in authority over us that give us orders that we cannot disobey without personal risk. So in that sense, we are not free. We don't have that freedom. And the third one is the freedom to recreate social relations, which is sort of the freedom to, if you're in sort of an autocratic system and you don't like it, you can have the freedom to change that social arrangement. Or if you're in sort of a socialist, egalitarian state and you don't like that, then you have the freedom to change that. Now, do we have that freedom today? Maybe, but I heard someone say the other day that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. So, do we have the freedom to sort of initiate a revolution? Maybe in sort of a Western liberal democracy, but the chances of that, because the system is so large and so ingrained and so many people have stakes in it, I don't know. But anyways, that's not the point of that book, is whether we're free or not. That was just me thinking. So they also talked about 3 methods of domination, or I'm gonna get this wrong, because there was 3 methods of domination, but then there was also 3 sort of measures of a state. Like they had a first level state, a second level state, and a third level state, depending on how many of these 1, 2, 3 things the state has. Which one is sovereignty, the sort of control over an area, charismatic politics, having individuals that are charismatic and can get people to sort of follow them. And I think the third was bureaucracy, having sort of administration and methods in place to be able to control people at a distance. You can have sovereignty, which is one person has ultimate power over life and death over people, but if they don't have the bureaucracy to extend their reach, then that power is only sort of literally as far as they can see. Like a king in a palace has life over death over everyone in the palace, but people 2 villages over that are still nominally under the king, he doesn't have that power unless he has the bureaucracy to extend his reach that far. But I think I'm getting this 3 methods of domination confused with something about a state's control over violence. Anyways, there's a lot to this book. I'm not going to remember it all. So what else do I have here in my notes? They talk about how, because they mention so many different examples of states, societies, civilizations, peoples, humans that have so many different ways of living. And they talk about how history has sort of ignored so many of those, not intentionally or maliciously. It's just the ones we understand that fit into the Russo sort of tribes, bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, early states, late states, agricultural states, like the ones that we can understand that fit into that sort of story, we understand, we can fit them into that story. But the ones that don't, we sort of don't know what to do with, or we think that's just some weird exception, or we sort of, we just don't know what to do with them, so we don't really pay attention to them. And I think that's what they said was part of the reason why they wanted to write this book, is because they couldn't find books on societies like that. So that's interesting. The only other thing I have in my notes was they mentioned this idea. I'm not sure if it's a term they coined. It might be the schismogenesis, where we can understand sort of having 2 peoples close to one another. Culturally, there's going to be exchange through trade or through people emigrating or whatnot. And so cultures were sort of blend and have shared characteristics. But the idea of schismogenesis is that two peoples nearby will sort of self-identify as the opposite of that other culture. So these two cultures will generate sort of completely divergent paths. Like they made reference to North American societies on the west coast of North America. In the south, there were, or I should say, in the North Pacific, there were societies that had sort of a strict hierarchy at certain times of the year, but they also practiced slavery. And the society just to the south of them had abolished slavery. How they wanted nothing to do with slavery. And even though these two were like really close to each other, they were vastly different culturally, and because of this schismogenesis, that is the other. I do not want to be like the other, so we are going to model ourselves to be the complete opposite of that other, and that's how these two sort of cultures were generated, which I thought was really interesting, a really interesting concept, not just in the past, but even in the present. I'm not sure if this is quite what they meant, but I think of like France and German culture, how they're right next to each other, but they, at least historically, they're historic enemies, so they might sort of model themselves differently, although not completely differently. They are both liberal democratic republics. Another one I'm thinking is Canada and the US, although they're so culturally almost the same. But there are certain things that, like, how do you define a Canadian? Well, they're an American who's proud to not be an American, whereas an American's proud to be an American. I don't know. Maybe I'm taking that totally how not they wanted it to be taken. Anyways, so yeah. Whew, there was so much in this book. Critique, if I can even have one, which I don't know if I can. A lot of I can sort of understand the anthropological examples they use, but the archaeological examples they use, to me, the evidence seems so thin and sparse as it is in archaeology that the archaeologist can sort of create what they want from the remains, and maybe sort of these examples, they're finding all these examples is because they're analyzing the evidence to sort of fit their hypothesis. Now that, I'm not saying that that's what they did, that's just something I'm thinking about. Like, did this occur? Is that why there's so many different examples of different societies? But I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm sure an archaeologist would be like, no, we are rigorous, scientific-minded people who have high standards, and we don't just make stuff up because we found stuff. I've only taken a handful of archaeology courses in undergrad, so I'm not saying what I just said. That's just something in the back of my mind, just trying to think critically. But I do think these are sort of trustworthy, brilliant people. So maybe I shouldn't even have mentioned that, but it's just, sometimes it just sort of boggles my mind how they can come to conclusions based on the little bits of evidence that they have. But that's just archaeology. Again, if I had studied archaeology, and I'm sure people who have studied archaeology can read this and understand it and sort of take them at their word, but I always have to play devil's advocate and question everything. So there. Overall, very big book. Lots and lots and lots of examples. Almost too big for me because it took me months to get through. But it was different, definitely sort of opened the door to so many different peoples and ways of thinking and ways of living and organizing socially that I'd never even considered, because we are so much stuck in this is the way things are. Society has progressed, humanity has progressed to this point, and this is sort of, what was it, Francis Fukuyama, who said that the end of history was in the 1990 or whatever it was. And how now we don't think, no, that wasn't the end of history. We're still progressing. But like after reading this, it's not a progress. We're not saying what happened in the past was sort of inferior, and we are now have a superior way of living. It is hard because of the technological advances that we have made. So it definitely feels like we are superior in ways like medicine, sanitation, technology, and communication and whatnot. But that doesn't mean our ways of organizing socially, our sort of what we call democracy, even though it's not really rule by people, it's rule of the few by consensus of the many. Anyways, that was The Dawn of Everything by the two Davids. Yeah, that's all I got.